Welcome to Club Soda's Global Mindful Drinking Festival. I hope you're all well. This afternoon, we're going to be talking with Jaeger, who's one of the co-founders of Club Soda. I'm Josh Kelly. I look after the Facebook group and events. Drew, what's your role within Club Soda? Quickly.
Oh golly! Well, I guess Josh, I'm one of Club Soda's co-founders. Laura and I dreamed this up together about 7 years ago. My day-to-day role is that I'm wholly responsible for all of our courses and programs for people who want to change their drinking. So if you sign up for one of our courses, I will have written it. I wrote our book, How to Be a Mindful Drinker. Hold on, I have it to hand. There we go. Wrote the book. And I run workshops and meditation sessions and discussion groups and all sorts of things. So if you're actively in the business of changing your drinking, you'll probably end up in contact with me quite a bit, really. That's me.
Fabulous. And we're talking about how does Drew drink mindfully.
Yeah.
But I thought it'd be good just to jump in if people out there who haven't met us before. What do we actually mean by mindful drinking?
Okay, so I guess there's two things to say, really. One is that mindful drinking is a whole suite of tools and techniques that you can use to pay attention to your relationship with alcohol and then decide how to change in a way that works for you. So mindful drinking is really about applying the philosophy of mindfulness to the subject of drinking. When we talk about mindful drinking, I think sometimes people hear moderation. And that's not necessarily what we mean. It's about paying attention to the role that alcohol plays in your life. It's about noticing your triggers. It's about understanding your thoughts and feelings, acting kindly towards yourself, learning how you want to have a relationship with alcohol or not, as that works for you. So that's really kind of what mindful drinking is about. It's about learning to pay attention and act with intention. For me, what that means is in my relationship with alcohol, I do drink alcohol occasionally. I get kind of badged as a moderate drinker, but I think when people hear that, they imagine somebody who's drinking several beers a night, 3 days a week. And that is absolutely not me. I drink rarely. I do drink, maybe a couple of times a month, but I drink relatively rarely. And I don't ever drink very much either. It's rare that I have more than a drink. So I don't drink very often. Alcohol actually just doesn't play a particularly big role in my life anymore, and that's been a massive change, and we'll talk about that. But yeah, so when I'm talking about this, there's two things. One is mindful drinking, which is this whole approach to changing your drinking, and then there's my own drinking, which is really very occasional and moderate these days.
Thank you. So we're looking at Drew as a mindful drinker. What started you on that journey?
Well, I suppose so. When I tell stories, one of the ways that my brain works, my episodic memory doesn't work very well, and I don't order events very clearly in time. So if this story kind of leaps all over the place, just kind of bear with it. Piece together the timeline afterwards. Imagine this is like an unfolding Doctor Who episode. There'll be a chart. You'll make it make sense. So I guess actually one place to start is actually in my work with Laura to get Club Soda started, because that's a really important bit of this journey for me. Actually, when I met Laura, I would describe my relationship with alcohol as being pretty non-thinking, to be honest. It wasn't that my drinking was never problematic. It really was at times, but it wasn't actually something that I ever considered was an issue for me, and I think earlier in my life, throughout my 30s, I would never have described myself as somebody who had issues with alcohol. It just wasn't a part of my vocabulary to think about my own drinking in that kind of way. And when I met Laura, actually, I was working in healthcare policy and research, and Laura had quit drinking a couple of years before, wanted to do something to support other people, and I was genuinely interested in that. Just from a health research and policy point of view, I wanted to see if we could work out a way to help people change, that was effective and that worked. And so my initial journey with Club Soda was really kind of driven by wanting to help and support other people. And it was actually only a couple of years into my experiences with Club Soda that I suddenly had this light bulb moment where I realized we might be talking to me too. And that my drinking might be something that I want to take a look at. I always had a fairly kind of accidental and opportunistic relationship with alcohol. I think that's probably the best way of describing it. I actually didn't come to drinking in a big way until my early 30s for reasons which are complicated and we may well get to. But when I really kind of came to drinking in a big way in my early 30s, I was the kind of person that if there was alcohol left on the table at the party, I would hunt it out and drink it. I was definitely always up for a good time. I spent the early part of my 30s drinking a lot, taking a inordinate quantity of different types of drugs, and partying really, really, really hard.
Why your 30s? Why most people do this in their sort of teens to early 20s or university?
Yeah, they do, don't they? Yeah. So let's work backwards a little bit in my story. Yeah, no, actually, really. So let's go right back to the beginning. Do you want the whole? Should we do the whole life story?
I mean, it's relevant.
Yeah. Okay. So I come from a relatively ordinary family, all things considered. My dad was away quite a lot for work. My mum was lovely, and apparently we had a very close relationship when I was small. My mum died suddenly when I was 9 years old. She suffered a massive brain hemorrhage. Literally, I woke up one morning and I had a mum, and by bedtime I didn't. She died that suddenly, and that her death and my experience of traumatic childhood bereavement, which is really what it was. I didn't have that language then, but that's what happened to me. Really has shaped really all of my experiences for the past 38 years. Her death continues to have a substantial impact on my life. One of the things that happened to me, kind of flowing out of that experience, is that at the age of 16, I was losing contact with my family in a kind of meaningful way. So I was fairly isolated, and I ended up joining a church which really turned out to be a cult, to be frank. And experienced conversion therapy, people trying to make me not queer, for several years, and really kind of faced with this terrible choice between fitting in and being myself. And I decided that my need for love and security was such that I wanted to fit in. I wanted to love and be loved and belonged much more than I needed to be who I was. And again, there's been damaging impacts of that, those issues as well for me. But really, from the age of 16 through to the age of 30, I lived a very socially conservative and conventional life. I got married when I was 20 years old. My son Ben was born when I was 25. Most people's late teens and 20s are filled with parties and nightclubs. Mine was filled with church services and coffee and garden centres. And then by my mid-20s, changing nappies, I actually, I worked for all sorts of Christian organisations, and I, in my late 20s, just when Ben was born, I ended up taking a couple of years out of work, and I looked after him full time. So literally, my mid-20s were full of nappy changes rather than hard partying.
So I'm guessing then when you left the church, you found yourself with money and time.
Yeah.
To explore.
Yeah, I mean, so my marriage came to an end at the end of my 20s. I realised that I couldn't sustain the dissonance between who I was on the inside, who I knew I was on the inside, and the life that I was living on the outside. And I knew that I needed to change something, and that started with being honest about who I was, and that sadly that brought my marriage to an end, and it left me at the beginning of my 30s exploring coming out, single on my own much of the time. I had caring responsibilities for my son at the weekend, but lots of the time during the week I was footloose and fancy free with money in my pocket and feeling like I was really catching up on lost time in lots of ways. I felt like I hadn't by any objective means had a normal teenage experience, and I felt that I'd really missed out. And so a lot of my I spent a lot of time in Soho and Vauxhall in my early 30s, and a lot of that was feeling like I've missed out and I want to catch up. And I threw myself at the business of having a good time. Somebody said to me a while ago, this whole kind of period of my life isn't one that I talk about very much, because to be honest, it's a period of my life that I don't feel good about in many ways. I've carried a lot of shame about these different experiences in my life, so it's really good to talk about it now. But I was talking to somebody recently, and I hadn't shared this story about my wild early 30s before, and the vast quantity of coke and MDMA that I did, and ketamine and all sorts of other stuff. But they kind of came at this with the view of, well, if somebody's drinking and if somebody's taking drugs, they're dealing with a problem. And so I told them the beginning of this story, and their initial response was, "Oh my goodness, that must have been so hard for you." And I was like, are you fucking joking? My early 30s were amazing. I had a brilliant time, and I don't regret that. I threw myself at life, and I threw myself at mood altering experiences, and just the brightest and most technicolor life that I could possibly imagine living.
So if it was so great and your memory is so good, why did you decide to pull out of it? What made you pull out of it? And did you stop the drugs and the drink at the same time?
Yeah, no. So my relationship with drugs changed actually when I was in a relationship for most of my 30s with somebody who wasn't a big club goer. And in the end, I decided that I loved him more than I loved cocaine, and that was an easy choice to make in the end. Also, taking illegal drugs is really expensive and legally dicey as well. So I was like, this was relatively easy. I'm not going to say that it was straightforward, but it was relatively easy to stop. You delete your dealer's phone number and you end up having quiet evenings in with your boyfriend instead, and that was good. My relationship with alcohol, though, I think has continued to evolve and change. One of the things which I noticed now, looking back at my later 30s, is that I was part of a group of friends where our socializing almost exclusively centered on drinking together. And I don't think I would ever have articulated for myself having a problem with alcohol. I wouldn't have put it in those kinds of words, but I was part of a group of friends where, 4 of us would get together for a Sunday lunch, and by the evening there'd be 9 empty bottles of wine. And by anyone's measure, that is a catastrophic amount of alcohol to drink in an afternoon. And very often it would leave me hungover and tired and exhausted on Monday morning, struggling to go to work, and there were times as well, because I've, as a result of my childhood experiences and later experiences, I live with the effects of trauma. I live with a history of mental ill health, of depression and anxiety, especially. It's World Mental Health Day as we're recording this, so important to say that. One of the ways in which I've coped with that and tried to live with the experience of being me is by numbing those things through alcohol and through drugs. And that isn't something that I feel particularly good about now, but is a way in which I did my best to be as good as I could be with the tools which I had. They just weren't brilliant tools, to be honest. So yeah, I don't think I would have ever described my relationship with alcohol as being really problematic. You know, if a doctor had asked me, if a friend had asked me, you know, I don't think I would have ever said my drinking was a problem. Looking back now, I realise absolutely that it was, and I can see all of the ways in which drinking wasn't helping me. I just thought that the kind of the
This
constant
is quite
hangovers and
classic.
feeling shit was part of the deal, to be honest.
Yeah, this is quite classic. What I see on the websites, not the website, on Facebook group a lot, is very much the story of this is how I was drinking, and I didn't see it as a problem at the time.
Yeah.
And also talking about mental health and depression and anxiety. Laura's doing a session at 12:30 on Tuesday about mental wealth with Ruth Cooper Dixon. You might want to tune in and have a look in. It's a nice sort of lock in there. But so, how did you decide that you needed to stop the drinking to improve your mental health?
Yeah, so really kind of a crunch point came for me in my early 40s. I'd actually been at the end of my 30s. I had a significant episode of mental illness. I ended up losing my job. I was basically incapacitated by depression for almost a year, and it took a long time to recover from that. And one of the things which I don't think I'd fully recognized at that point was that, you know, although I can't account for the, you know, the nature nurture argument about mental health. I don't think for me is particularly helpful. I don't know how much is in me and how much is because of the experiences that I've had in life, but I do know that I'm vulnerable to periods of mental ill health. And one of the ways in which I know that I can provoke periods of being unwell is by subjecting myself to ongoing stress. I know that now. I don't think that I really knew that at the beginning of my 40s. So I'd been through this period of being significantly unwell, and I'd started to rebuild a life again. And I then started to see the warning signs that something was about to go wrong. You know, I was constantly tired. I was starting to use substances in a way which didn't make me happy. I began to notice, actually, I'm beginning to become unwell. You know, I had a short period back on medication, and I was like, no, I want to do something differently about this. And it really came out. There was a determination in me, and I think that I wanted to understand myself better. I wanted to understand my mental health better, but also I wanted to learn how to look after myself better. You know, as I say, you know, I can't. I think I will always carry a vulnerability to mental ill health, just because of who I am and the life that I've had. But I can learn to notice and pay attention to the things which are going to make me unwell. Long-term stress, insecurity, complexity, difficulty, you know, all sorts of things can like provoke responses in me. And I decided to take my mental health seriously. This is where it kind of comes to in the end. I decided that my mental health, looking after my mental health, is going to take top priority over everything else. And so I literally, I basically, I took my life apart bit by bit, and kind of worked out, what do I need to do to live well? And it turns out, you know, my needs are remarkably few and simple. And I decided that along the way, I realized alcohol is making a negative contribution to my mental health. It is not helping me deal with difficult emotions well. And the consequences of drinking too much that I feel are actively exacerbating my likelihood of feeling unwell, you know, of experiencing depression or anxiety. And I can do without it. I think that was the big thing, is just realizing this isn't, as a general everyday activity, drinking isn't adding value to my life. And so I went through a process of, I started by cutting down. One of the big early things that I did is that I made a big category switch. So I basically decided, if I'm going to drink beer, my beer drinking is largely just going to be alcohol free. So I made a big category switch away from drinking beer. And that, to be honest, reduced my alcohol consumption by about 80% overnight, without even blinking. Suddenly
So
I was
away
drinking
from wine onto beer.
away from alcoholic beer to alcohol-free beer. I just
Okay.
literally swapped. Every time that I thought to myself, I fancy a beer, I thought I'll have an alcohol-free beer instead, And I got into the habit of going to the pubs which had good alcohol-free beer. And if I was at a party or a social event and somebody offered me a drink and I thought I fancy a beer, I went, have they got an alcohol-free beer? And it just became a thing that I did. I just went, if it's beer, it's going to be alcohol-free. And that made a massive and immediate difference to my alcohol consumption, because my drinking was largely beer centered. Suddenly I was drinking 80% less alcohol than I was before. And then the other thing which I started doing is started taking breaks altogether. So I was left with, drinking bourbon occasionally. That was, that continues to be a thing that I enjoy. But I was left drinking bourbon occasionally, but I was going through, maybe I'm just going to take a break. And I think the longest break I ended up taking was just over a year of not drinking any alcohol at all. But, I take off several weeks, or I take a month, or I take a bit longer. And then, as I say, a really long break. And I think it was during that time that I suddenly realized that the language around moderation had stopped working for me, because I wasn't carrying around an expectation that drinking was a normal part of my life. There wasn't a set amount of alcohol that I expected to consume that I was cutting down from, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I actually just began to see that I'm pretty much alcohol free by default. That's my, if I go to the supermarket, I'm not buying alcohol. If I'm planning my weekend, I'm not thinking about drinking. I'm not planning to go to the pub. I'm basically living a life which is alcohol free by default. And that, I think, really now defines how I drink.
Sorry, because you said you stopped for a year, and it sounded like your brain shift was fairly simple. But a lot of our members talk about exactly the opposite. They're planning when they can have a drink, or they're all the time thinking that they're missing out, and that they're actually finding the swap from alcohol beer to alcohol-free beer not as straightforward. But for you, it's fairly easy.
Yeah. So I guess one thing that's really important to say in this is that although I would characterize my drinking before I started changing, I characterized my drinking as opportunistic. I drink if it was there. It was definitely absent-minded. I wasn't paying attention at all. And it was occasionally catastrophic. I have my abiding memory of my brilliant 40th birthday weekend, which was fabulous. But my abiding memory is Saturday night on my own, once everyone had gone, hugging the toilet and being sick, because I hadn't noticed how much I was drinking, and I got myself into a real mess, and I felt terrible the next day, all sorts of things. I occasionally had literally disastrous night. The one morning, just to share a kind of an alcohol horror story, there was one night where I'd been out drinking till literally 5 o'clock in the morning, and I'd gone home and I'd kind of thought, oh fuck, I need to go to work. And I'd had a bath. I hadn't slept. I had a bath. I drank coffee. I got up. I went to work, thought that I could power through on zero sleep, still a skinful of alcohol. I sat at my desk at 10 o'clock in the morning, and I turned to my colleague and I said, is it just me, or can you smell gin? And she went, sweetheart, that's you.
Oh, gosh.
So, there were times where my drinking was catastrophically terrible and I was just in utter denial about how bad it was. But having said all that, I feel really fortunate that my relationship with alcohol was never compulsive. When I woke up feeling terrible from drinking, my first thought wasn't, I need a drink of alcohol to make this better. My first thought was, have I got any fizzy orange and mini cheddars? I would drink a party dry, but I wouldn't then go past an off license on the way home. And certainly I wasn't planning for drinking. That it just wasn't. It happened accidentally, opportunistically, disastrously, but never compulsively. Um, and I think that's a really important thing to say, because I think we do in our culture, we do tell a very all or nothing story about drinking. We put people who have experienced problems with drinking in a particular category. And then we imagine that stopping drinking is the only way to solve that problem. And in reality, you can be somebody like me who was drinking in ways which were actively harmful to my physical health and well-being, but not compulsively. And we are the types of people who need to change too. That's not a good relationship with alcohol to have. I'm really glad that I've learned what I've learned about drinking. I'm really glad that I'm not drinking the same way anymore. And I think that's a really important message to say. If you are experiencing negative effects as a result of drinking, even if it's just, your at-home drinking is fine, but whenever you go out with that particular group of friends, you always have too much. It's worth thinking about and doing something about that situation and seeing if you can improve it. I guess that's the kind of key thing which I've learned, is don't take drinking for granted. Even if it's, I did that for such a long time. I just thought the crappy way that I felt after I drank and the crappy way that I felt about drinking was normal. I didn't realize that it was okay to cut down. I didn't realize it was okay to take breaks. I didn't realize it was okay to take extended time off. I just thought that the crap that came with drinking was part of the business of being a grown up. I didn't realize there was a different way to live, and I wish I had known, because I would have made different choices earlier than I did.
Pulls us beautifully into the club soda ethos, that we're not about stop. It's stop, pause, take a break.
Yeah.
Become mindful. There's all different ways of addressing someone's drinking, and everyone's reason for addressing their drinking is different.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, everyone's is different. In my working club soda, obviously I end up talking to a lot of people about people particularly starting our courses who are unhappy with the way that they're drinking. And some of those people talk to me about a relationship with alcohol which feels like it's become all-consuming, that they feel like they've got to a stage where they can't not drink, where it really has become that kind of grind of compulsive, addictive type of alcohol consumption. Other people start this journey by saying, I feel like wine o'clock's an hour earlier than it used to be, and I don't like who I am when I'm drinking, and I feel like I'm letting down my family because I'm getting pissed on Saturday nights and I'm not there for my kids on a Sunday morning. I think we're waking up to the fact that you can address challenges with drinking, and you don't need to reach rock bottom to do that. I'm always really excited when I have conversations with people who are in their 20s about drinking, and some of them have got themselves into drinking difficulty really rapidly, and others of them are just saying, I don't think that I want to do this. I'm not enjoying this. And I want to find different ways to connect with people. And I want to enjoy the whole of my weekend without a hangover. And I want to do well at work. And I want to make a positive contribution to society and all of these things. And I don't think that alcohol has to be a part of that. And I'm like, no, you're right. Alcohol doesn't have to be a part of that. Brilliant. Welcome to our world. You know, there are possibilities that open up when you start thinking about your relationship with alcohol and decide that you want to configure it in a different kind of way.
This is such a, I feel like we've sort of reached a space where we could go off in lots of different directions, following up on those threads. But I'd like to bounce at you. Why did you decide to be a mindful drinker and not stop altogether? Was it your intention to stop altogether at one point? Or, I mean, you've used in the past, you've used the word add value.
Yeah.
When you're talking about drinking. So what was it there for you? Why not stop? Why moderate or adding value?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? Because actually, now I have basically one of the things which is really important to know. If you take any time off alcohol, is that your tolerance for alcohol is basically going to disappear. And so now I am an absolute lightweight when it comes to booze. I mean, literally, I'm a very, very cheap date because a pint of lager.
Was that an advert, Drew?
Well, I am single, you know. It's important for people to know this, but I am a very cheap date, you know, because a glass of wine and I'm quite merry, you know. So because I have zero tolerance for alcohol, it actually affects me now. It never used to. So that's a really important actually thing for people to know. If you are taking a break, please don't go back to drinking like you used to, because it's really, really going to hurt. And that actually for me genuinely is part of my calculation. If I'm going to have a drink, is actually recognizing I might actually feel a bit rubbish the next day. You know, I might feel the effects of this in a way which isn't particularly great. But I think we do a disservice to ourselves if we don't talk about the fact that alcohol can add value to life, that it can be a pleasurable experience, that alcohol in the right context, with the right people, in the right situation, consciously chosen, can feel like a good thing. And I would be an idiot if I didn't say that, because you know what, 75% of the world's population thinks that that's true. You know, there are significant proportion, like the majority of people in our society go, well, I drink because I enjoy it. You know, and I think that's okay. That seems like a very radical thing to say in this kind of context, but it's okay to want to drink because you like it. I feel like I'm saying desperately controversial things, but you know, no. If you are going to, because I have this conversation with people who are thinking about moderating and having a drink, and then crippling themselves with guilt the next day because they had fun. And I'm like, what else were you drinking for? You were drinking because you thought that it would make the situation that you were in better. So if it did that, you've got nothing to feel bad about. You know, we need to have a grown up and honest conversation about alcohol and say it's not all bad. If it was all bad, none of us would ever do it at all. You know,
straight into mindful drinking, being mindful about why am I drinking? What's the reason? What's the occasion? What am I aiming to get out of it?
Yeah. Yeah, so a very real example for me about, you know, because I do say, because I'm basically alcohol free by default. I don't have routine drinking. You know, that's one of the areas that people get into difficulty. But routine drinking is not part of my life. It's not how I think. You know, I don't expect to open a bottle of wine with a Friday takeaway or with Sunday dinner. You know, that I just don't. I don't expect to drink when I go out with friends to the pub. I expect to drink alcohol-free drinks. So broadly speaking, alcohol doesn't figure into my thinking. But there are occasions where I think to myself, alcohol would add value here. And just as an example, last summer, my son turned 21, and I went out to the pub with my brother and my son to celebrate. And, you know, we were I forget where we were in COVID restrictions, but it was all very like booking it. We might have had to sit outside. I forget anyway. But so it was never going to be a big raucous night anyway. But I did what I normally do when I go to the pub. And my not drinking generally is totally non-controversial in my family now because I've been at it for a while. So I bought the first round. I bought myself something alcohol-free. My brother bought the next round. He bought me something alcohol-free. And then my son came to buy a round. And he asked me what I wanted to drink. And I thought, this is my son turning 21. We're sitting in a lovely country pub. I've had 2 alcohol-free drinks. That's what I normally do when I go out. What do I want to do right now? And I said, and I found myself saying out loud, I'd really like a pint of bitter shandy, please. And so he went off to the bar. You know, always very exciting when you're 21, but still remembering you need to take your passport and ID because they'll, you know, ID you. But he went off and he bought his dad a bitter shandy on his 21st birthday. And he came back and I enjoyed it, you know, and, you know, as is entirely predictable, going back to my previous zero tolerance for alcohol comment, I got a bit giggly. An hour later, of course, I was completely stone cold sober because I processed the tiny amount of alcohol in a bitter shandy, and we went home, and it was all good. And I think that's where I kind of like that's where my relationship with alcohol is now. You know, it's being able to see it for what it is, realizing that there are positives and negatives to it, but I don't have to live in a world where alcohol is universally terrible. I can appreciate the value that and the pleasure that it can add to a situation, and I don't want to feel embarrassed or ashamed or awkward about that. It's just part of my relationship. I do want to say that's my relationship with alcohol.
Absolutely. So
might not be true for you, but that's where I've got to.
Yeah. Do you think then you need to be addicted to alcohol for it to cause you problems?
No, goodness me, no. So addiction as a subject is super complex. When we talk about addiction, and particularly addiction to a substance like alcohol,
You wouldn't say that you were addicted.
We need to unpick that word a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when we're talking about alcohol as an addictive substance, alcohol is both physically and psychologically addictive. So we can become physically dependent on it. It literally, if we are drinking regularly, especially if we're drinking a lot, but actually sometimes not very much, if we're drinking regularly over time and not taking breaks, alcohol becomes part of our body adapts to alcohol's presence. And our brain chemistry changes, and our body tries to stay in equilibrium even as we're drinking. So we can become physically dependent on alcohol. That basically means if we suddenly take alcohol out of the equation, we're going to feel the effects of that because we experience alcohol withdrawal symptoms. And so alcohol can be physically we can become physically dependent on it, which is why stopping suddenly can be dangerous if you've been drinking a lot. It's why you might feel sweats and shakes after binge drinking. It's not that you've got a hangover, you're actually experiencing alcohol withdrawal. So that's a really important thing to know and to be careful about if you're changing your drinking. If you drink a lot, don't stop drinking suddenly if you think you might be physically dependent. But alcohol, it also breeds psychological dependency. So we begin to... Alcohol ends up taking up space in our lives in all sorts of different ways. For me, I don't think that I knew how to build relationships with people that didn't center on drinking. You know, during my 30s, all of my friendships were made in bars and clubs and parties. That's how I did relationship building throughout my 30s. If I went on a date, we'd go for a drink. If I wanted to meet new people, I'd go to a party. If I wanted to get to know somebody, I'd ask them for a drink. I'd take my work colleagues out for a drink. You know, drinking was a big part of my social life. And so I've had to learn how to be in relationships with people that aren't about getting drunk together. And that, that's a whole kind of big thing that I've learned as well. So no, I was never physically dependent on alcohol. I think I definitely was psychologically dependent, particularly for when it came to connection and social drinking. I needed alcohol to make my social life work. I live with anxiety, so I find being in groups of people quite challenging. This one-on-one conversations I love, but big groups I find difficult, and alcohol made that easier for me. But no, you don't need to put yourself in that category of I'm an alcohol addict, or worse, I'm an alcoholic, which is not a word that we use in Club Soda. I know that people do use it. There will be people watching this at some point who've Googled at 2:00 in the morning, am I an alcoholic? The answer is it's complex, and that language probably isn't going to help you, and doctors don't use it, and we don't use it generally. But you don't have to put yourself in a particular category of identity around drinking or not drinking to say that alcohol is a substance that I want a different kind of relationship with. If you think about this like your relationship with alcohol, like your relationship with a person, you don't need to be at the point of divorce to go to marriage counseling. If there's something that's wrong in your relationship, you would sit down and talk to your partner about it, hopefully, or if you couldn't talk about it with them, you'd seek support so that you'd work out how to make it better. And sometimes you might have a joint, there are all sorts of ways in which we make relationships better that don't rely on things falling apart before we do something. And it's a similar thing with alcohol. Don't wait until you are drinking every day, because drinking and physically dependent, and where alcohol is every part of your life. Don't wait. If you wait for that point, you've made the problem so much harder to fix. If you know that there's a problem now, address it now. Don't wait until it's awful. If there's something that's wrong right now, work out what you're going to do right now to make it better. And that doesn't necessarily mean stopping. It could mean taking a break. It could mean cutting down. It could mean finding different alcohol-free drinks. It could be reducing the ABV of your drinks, choosing lower strength alcoholic drinks. There are all sorts of ways in which you can address it. But that's the kind of, if there's a problem, don't ignore it.
And what's really interesting is, with that analogy, is a lot of people, rather than address an issue that's going on with their life, they mask it with alcohol.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's not even alcohol that's the primary problem.
Yeah, I think okay, so let's talk about that. If right now you're wrestling with drinking, and there will be people listening to this who know what that's like. If alcohol has become all consuming in your life and you're struggling, alcohol is a problem that you will need to address. And there are some practical things that you can do about weaning yourself alcohol, stopping safely, cutting down gradually over time. Learning to not drink is a really important skill, especially if alcohol has just become part of the warp and weft of life. Learning to say no, learning how to do that is a really important skill. But we drink because it solves problems. For me, when I think about relationships and social anxiety, alcohol solved a problem, which is that I don't do well at parties. If I'm not drinking at a party, you'll find me either doing the washing up or talking to your dog. That's where I'm comfortable. I'm not good at parties, but so alcohol seems to solve that problem for me, right? 3 drinks and I'm happy to chat to anyone. So having addressed my challenges with alcohol and kind of dealt with that, I'm still left with that problem that I'm shit at parties.
Which is really interesting, because I've seen you at Queers Without Beers and other sober events that we've run.
Yeah.
And you come across as super personable, super confident, really good connector, really good at talking, really good in the group.
Yeah.
And yet you actually don't feel that.
No, no, I really struggle.
Yeah.
And but I've learned some things which really help me. And the one thing that really helps me, and you will have observed this if you've seen me in like socially interacting with people, is that I ask people lots of questions. I stand there with a drink in my hand because that, there's a comfort thing in that. There's some physical contact with something. I find that reassuring. But I'll stand there with a drink in my hand and I keep asking questions. And that for me is a brilliant way of dealing with my anxiety in social situations. Because I basically I put the spotlight on somebody else. I don't have to answer questions about me and how I'm
Which a lot of
feeling.
people love. A lot of people love having that spotlight shone on them.
Oh my
What,
God, it's
talk about
yeah.
myself? Really? You want to hear about me?
I want to hear about, that thing that you said was boring. No, tell me all about that. I want to know all about that. And people are like, really? And I'm like, yes. And also secretly, this really helps me.
But
It really helps me
pitfall.
deal with my anxiety. So yeah, it's my number one way of dealing with those. So that's the solution that I found. Not getting drunk, asking questions, but it solves the problem. And I think that's the thing, when you take alcohol out of the picture and you are left with, oh God, there are all of these reasons that I drank. There are all of these problems that I was trying to solve. What on earth do I do with all of those things now? You can find other solutions, and they're not going to be drinking. They are going to be other things. So for me, yeah, social anxiety is solved by asking questions, not by drinking. There will be other situations for you, but you just experiment and you find what works.
Which is mindfulness again. It's planning
Yeah,
how you
yeah,
want to be. But I would say to anybody out there, it's not just asking questions. If you don't listen to the answers as well, you find yourself in a real mess later on in the
yeah,
conversation. So
yeah.
you've got to listen to the answers. Okay. We've got about 15 minutes left. I was wondering, have there been more, any recent big revelations in your life? Any events where it really brought alcohol to the forefront again?
Yeah, so I've just been to a big family wedding in Ireland. And when you say I'm going to a family wedding in Ireland, that immediately brings to mind all sorts of images about the consumption of Guinness and Jamesons, particularly in country pubs. And it absolutely lived up to those expectations in a way which was glorious and fun and brilliant. I absolutely loved it. I guess I noticed two big things around that event, though. One was, for as much as I talk about this stuff and I teach this stuff all of the time, I, particularly about kind of planning for events in advance and dealing with anxiety, I don't actually very often put myself in the situation where I need my own advice. And I found myself in the run up to going to Ireland for about 6 weeks before. It's interesting when I look back on my journal. For about 6 weeks before, I started worrying about it. I started worrying about, because I am somebody, and I will drink, and I did drink at different points during the time that I was in Ireland. I started to worry about, do I want to drink? Do I not want to drink? How am I going to know whether having a drink is a good thing or not? How am I going to cope if there isn't an alcohol-free drink behind the bar? How am I going to, I found myself thinking quite a lot. And it was actually as I was traveling to Ireland, I suddenly went, I just need to follow my own advice. For goodness sake, what is wrote with me?
You
So
wrote the course. Listen to the
yeah,
course.
so I went back to stuff which I've written in our courses about planning for social events and finding out what people have behind bars and and I reminded myself of all of these good things. And I think so that's a big thing which I've learned is that for as confident as I feel generally about the subject of alcohol, um, I there will still be situations where it's going to be a challenge for me, and and that good advice that we follow, that we give, 2 drinks first, planning in advance, thinking about menus, working out when you're going home, it all works. That's why we share it. It's because it actually works, and I've got lived experience in the past 2 weeks of all of that advice really working. The other thing which really struck me in that experience, and particularly on the second day, we decamped to a lovely country pub, out in the middle of nowhere in Wexford. What I noticed in kind of like my anthropological observation of other people's drinking behaviour, which is always a good way to spend time in pubs, by the way, if you're not drinking, is I noticed how difficult people find it to be in a pub and not drink. I noticed two things going on. One was people going to the bar, ordering a drink, coming back to sit at a table, drinking their drink, and then sitting there with an empty glass looking sad because they didn't know what else to do. And then I also noticed people going back to the bar repeatedly ordering alcoholic drinks, and then being surprised that they'd got drunk. But almost like kind of wishful thinking that I'm gonna go to the bar again, but this one is going to be fine. You know, the next one's going to be fine. The next one's going to be fine. And before you know it, you're actually calling a cab 2 hours earlier than you thought you would because you don't know how to not drink. And that I think I suddenly noticed for the first time how much an environment like a pub, but not just a pub, but how much our environment makes drinking inevitable. You know, whether it's the position of your drinks cabinet at home, or the way in which you spend time in a pub, or the party that you go to, or the family barbecue that you organise, if you're not consciously thinking about drinking, it is going to happen. And I feel really so fortunate in that environment that I am actively thinking about my next drink. What are the alcohol-free options that are available? How am I going to pace myself and slow down? When am I going to eat? When am I going to eat in relation to an alcoholic drink? But how am I going to make this work? I'm actively engaged in that conversation with myself, which means that my drinking in that situation isn't accidental, and it isn't just driven by the environment that I'm in. But I suddenly noticed that really for the first time, and I would want people to just begin to notice what's going on around you when you drink. Notice the way in which the environment that you're in makes drinking a foregone conclusion. And if it does, then start to pay attention to that, and then start to consider how you can act differently. Because you can do it. You can be in a pub and not drink, but you won't do that unless you're thinking about it, because the pub is designed to help you drink. So just be conscious of the environment that you're in. That's the big lesson recently.
Some people would say though, gosh, that sounds like a hell of a lot of work to be planning when I'm going to eat.
Yeah,
that sounds exhausting. But it becomes part of your normal way of operating.
Yeah, actually, for me, it wasn't exhausting. You know, actually, it meant that I got to enjoy being in a wedding in a country pub in Ireland. I had a brilliant time for 6 hours. It was excellent. It was really good. I had a brilliant time, you know. And actually, in reality, those decision-making points, there were literally 7 or 8 of them over a couple of hours, where I went, oh, there's food arrived. Am I going to have a drink? Because I was in an Irish country pub. I wanted to drink Guinness. Should I get Guinness first, or I'll eat first? No, I'll eat first. And that's the decision done. You know, I went to get a plate of food as soon as I ate my plate of food. And then the next time somebody said, do you want a drink? I went, I'd love a pint of Guinness. You know, so it was a simple decision. I wasn't labored. It wasn't difficult. And I certainly didn't find myself fighting and struggling. There were times where I turned down a drink. You know, somebody said, do you want one? I was like, no, I'm good, thanks. I'm good. You know, so there were decisions, but it wasn't like I wasn't sitting there kind of like racked in concentration for 6 hours. I danced and had a good time. It was brilliant.
We're running out of time, and there's a couple of questions. But I think I'd like to say, like learning any new skill, you've got to practice. It's about training. It's about making something new the norm.
Yeah.
And then what is the norm? It's easy.
Yeah.
So we had a question from one of our members. Their wife is not drinking anymore. She's trying to go alcohol free, and they've been supporting it by also going alcohol free. But they would like to occasionally have a drink again, but they're still
Yep.
going to support their partner.
Yeah.
How would they go about doing
I can't really kind of come at this from personal experience. I haven't been in that situation myself. Not recently, anyway. I think the most important thing to do is actually to talk to your partner about what's going to help them. My experience is, people who go alcohol free, particularly, but people who moderate as well, will go through phases of feeling differently about drinking. There may be a period of time where they're pretty angry about alcohol and they just want nothing to do with it. And the thought of even having it in the house is just unbelievably triggering and upsetting. There'll be other times in which they're kind of okay about it. They don't care what somebody else is doing. It doesn't really matter to them. So I would really think about, having an ongoing conversation with your partner about what's okay for them and be led by them. If they are not okay with you drinking at home, then, that's something that you'll decide whether you want to kind of support them in that or not. I guess, it's all about your relationship and how you want to be together. I mean, the other thing that I would say is I just want to applaud this person for taking a break to support their partner, because I speak to so many, like a tragically large number of people in our community who are cutting down or stopping drinking and not feeling supported by their partner. So thank you for supporting your partner. You're actually making their job a lot easier. One of the things, I guess, which is worth kind of reflecting on, and you may want, again, this is a conversation to have with your partner, is just to think about all of the different ways in which you can connect, which don't necessarily center on drinking. Drinking can unconsciously become part of how we relate to others, and it can, we can feel its absence in ways which it isn't really absent. I'm sorry, not being very clear. So take Friday night in front of the telly on the sofa together. For lots of couples, take away a bottle of wine, nonsense on the telly becomes a good way of bonding and connecting at the end of the week. And if you take alcohol out of the equation, you might feel that there's something missing, but actually the core of that was never the wine. It was always the conversation. So think about all of the different ways in which you can make time for each other, that you can connect with each other, that you can listen to each other, and that you can respond to each other's needs. It may be that for your partner who's quit drinking, that actually suddenly this is opening up emotional space for her to pay attention in new ways. So actually you might benefit from that. So just kind of make it an ongoing conversation about how you can best support each other. I think that's my best advice.
That's great. Andrew, I love hearing you talk. You've got such a pleasant voice to listen to. I'd like to say to anyone out there, Drew is actually running 2 change intensive courses over next weekend, one for the UK and one for the US. You get to spend 7 hours, is it?
Yeah.
7 hours with Drew online, talking, answering questions, giving you advice. So if you're interested in that, go to our website and you can find out all about the course. One last quick question.
Yep. You
said this a while ago to me. You said we've got to consider that 70% of the people on the planet regularly drink a psychotropic drug. Is that the right word?
Yeah, psychoactive.
Psychoactive drug. We've got to deal with this. What's your takeaway advice?
So whether you are whatever your relationship is with alcohol right now, I just want to encourage you to start talking about it. Talk about it with your friends, with your family, in social situations. Don't let alcohol be a thing that you take for granted. We are overwhelmingly, the majority of people on this planet are regularly consuming this psychoactive substance, and none of us have proper conversations about what it does for us. It's okay that it does good things for us. That's an important thing to say. This isn't about going out to people to get them to tell you the worst things about drinking, but just begin to have the conversation about what do you think about alcohol? You know, what's, you know, and particularly I think right now we're at this really unique place in our position where we, in our history, where globally we're going through this extraordinary experience of a pandemic, of lockdowns, of illness, of all sorts of restrictions on society, and it's opening up conversations about drinking in new ways. You know, if you went to your friends and said, I really caned it during the first lockdown and I'm taking a break right now, what's your drinking been like during lockdowns of the pandemic? People can answer that question right now. So I would just encourage everyone, regardless of whether you are changing your drinking or not, if alcohol plays any role in your life at all, please start talking about it.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Drew.
Brilliant. Thank you, Josh.
So, no, you're welcome. So everybody at home, Laura will be doing her Monday motivation tomorrow at midday, and she'll give a full rundown of the events that we're running in the coming week and the following weekend. Drew will be doing his change intensive next weekend, and also on Tuesday at 12:30 you can listen to Laura on Instagram Live talking about mental wealth, which ties in beautifully with what I think we've been talking about today with Drew. So thanks everyone for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
You've been fantastic.
Brilliant. Take care, everyone. Cheers. Have a good afternoon.
Cheers then. Bye bye.